Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. A very good day to everyone, wherever they are in the world. And I'm really excited to talk about this very topical issue of the gender data gap. I think we would all agree that, everybody everywhere is talking about the need for more gender data, including as well the need for more robust, reliable, and evidence-based gender water data. And the World Water Assessment Program produced a recent report where they identified these statistics that only 37% of countries are producing any sex disaggregated data on just even one aspect of water, which is access to clean water. And 45.2% of countries do not produce any gender statistics at all. So clearly, I think I do want to sort of emphasize here that we do need more gender water data. But I also really want to talk about in today's presentation is, are we obsessing in the right ways with data? Are we paying attention to what type of data we are collecting, how we are collecting that data, and how we are enabling, evidence-based action on the data that has been collected? And I think these few words by Lauren Woodman, who's the CEO of NetHope, sort of a consortium of development partners, private sector, and donors, is really important, because I think we need to be asking these bigger, broader questions when we talk about the need for more gender water data. Again, the UNESCO World Water Assessment Program emphasizes very clearly that without good data, there will be no gender equity in water. And what it also makes evident in the report is that not only do we need more robust gender disaggregated data, but then this data has to be available and accessible and be able to influence evidence-based decision-making. So again, I think the how and the why of the data are being emphasized very much. So I think the question that we need to ask ourselves today is really, what is good data? And what are the factors that determine that data will translate into evidence and into action? And I think, fundamentally what is very interesting for me is what is data? I think when we talk about data, we immediately see numbers in our head. Does that mean numbers are the only data? Would a photo story book on water, for example, count as data? And what other types of data might there be available? And I think all of these are fundamentally important, because one thing is very clear in my work that I have done. We spend quite a lot of time of local communities of poor women in collecting the data, and so little of that data actually is sent, taken back to the communities and to even to inform, but then also to allow for capacity and agency development of these communities. So I think a lot of the data, gets taken on by intermediary actors like us researchers and scientists, and we use it obviously with the good intention to benefit the target groups, but in ways that are quite exclusionary. So I think what's really interesting is, I wanted to bring out to you, is that not all data that you see is not necessarily true. And I wanted to share with you this very interesting example of data, of a popular data source of fact. What is identified as fact is a common narrative that in relation to agriculture, women own less than 5% of agricultural land, or generally women own less than 2% of agricultural land. And many others, including from researchers at the CGIAR, have pointed out that this is really not true. So the question then becomes, not so much like how these data sets were arrived at, but also maybe why do these myths persist? So I think fundamentally what people who are studying these sort of data, generalized data, which is often not correct, point out that, it really helps. Like these shocking stories, like women own less than 2% of land, is so powerful, right? It can become a really powerful advocacy tool, even if it is not quite true. The other really important thing is that there is some sort of inertia, like once some data is established, let's say in a particular country or a group of countries, and the average adds up to 2%, then, it becomes sort of this very shocking story, then becomes the ground truth and very difficult to change. Which then points to the fact that how much time and resources are we actually spending in really understanding ground realities, in really getting data from the ground. And I mean, should we worry so much about the fact that this is not true and is a myth? I think, you could argue that, oh, never mind, a good myth is, if it helps the cause of gender, should definitely be taken forward. But I think it adds up to the fact that these sort of, stylized facts, as has been stated in a publication, really promote stereotypes of women, and women are not an equal group. They ignore the role of men, communities, and institutions in the communal act of agriculture, in this case, and can therefore provide a very simplistic and even misleading basis for design of and implementation of policies and programs. So I think we really need to be very careful about what might be data myths that exist there. And this link here, has some really interesting big aggregate figures on water that you might want to look at some point of time. So talking about the inertia that exists, in an earlier research study that I had done, we found this to be really true. A very popular data set fact that is a narrative that is often repeated is that 1 in 10 school age going African girls do not attend school during menstruation. So when we were doing this study, in 2014, and definitely the figures would have changed by now, we found that there were 382 unique matches for this quotation. And most of these 382 matches were referring the source of this data to UNICEF. Then we really scoured the UNICEF site to look at which document that was traceable to, and we did not find this link. And in fact, what we found is a report in 2006, which said something quite different, that girls sometimes do not attend school during menstruation or drop out at puberty because of a lack of sanitation facilities. It did not mention these numbers, 1 in 10 do not attend, so I think what happens then is simply that inertia, that somebody has, outlined a certain figure and fact, maybe which was true in a very specific context at a very specific time, and that sort of becomes cemented as the gender water narrative. So I think this is something really also important to look at, is how do we collect data, and why are we getting this data, and Christopher Scott, or James Christopher Scott, who's written a couple of very interesting books, including this one that you can see here, talks quite a lot about data and how there is a data obsession in the development world, because data is really essentially about control, it's about knowledge, and it shows that you have purpose. what's not really discussed, obviously these are very powerful gains for various development actors. But how do we actually get this data? And Chris Scott talks about the fact that, often the methods and questions that are used are quite aggressive. Like, for example, we don't think twice about asking poor and marginalized women, when did your husband beat you up last? Did you buy, do you take, protection for sex? When did you last have diarrhea, etc.? Questions that, are often asked in a survey format without actually necessarily building that social connect and network with the individual. I mean, these would be very abusive questions if they were asked to you and I by random strangers, right? The other important issue is that, are the lives of marginalized women really changing with the data that we are producing? And as I said before, do we even take the data back to these women? Do we allow them to see how they could use the data? Do we design the data so that they could, benefit from it and gain some agency and control and advocacy as well at their level? So I think a lot of things to be very reflective about in collecting data. Again, from this World Water Assessment Program, these are some of the popular narratives around water that, for example, in rural India and Africa, women, more than 30% of women's daily energy is spent on fetching water, or the number of billion women hours spent each year fetching water. So these are narratives that get thrown at every now and then. So every time you open something on gender and water, you get the same facts and figures. And not very sure, for all the reasons that I've already discussed, how true these might be. But, a more thoughtful data set, a more thoughtful way of collecting data, for example, what might it be? And I just wanted to give you an example of the work of Sarah Young at Northwestern University and what she calls the household and individual water insecurity assessments. So this is a very, very simple toolkit that takes just 3 minutes to complete, and the respondents are asked about a number of, about 12, as you can see, issues that have been, that were developed through a lot of extensive qualitative analyses, and ask about, how their water use was related to any of these issues. And the responses options are fairly simple. It takes less than 3 minutes, or around 3 minutes, for respondents to answer these issues. And that is really important because, often when we are collecting large volumes of data, we tend to assume that time is not a premium for marginalized women, even though we are really talking about how much time they spend collecting water and doing all sorts of chores in an increasingly challenging context. So what's also interesting about this particular issue is that it talks not just of the physical dimensions of water scarcity, but it also talks about the psychosocial dimensions, how water scarcity affects one's mental health, well-being, etc. So, as I said, it gives a very holistic picture of household or individual water insecurity, and provides, when done at an individual level, provides a very human voice to the water sector. It's comparable because it's one framework, one methodology. It's comparable across different contexts. It's very quick to collect, relatively simple to analyze. And Sarah claims that, this sort of evidence can be used to really hold stakeholders accountable. So that's the last point that I want to talk about before I end, which is really how accountable. I mean, what's the evidence that data is leading to accountability of key institutions in relation to water? So I draw upon some insights from Sally Abi Khalil, who's the Middle East and North Africa director of Oxfam. And this was, these slides are drawn from a recent joint presentation that we had at the UN Water Conference in New York. And Sally makes some really, really interesting insights. And I think those, what she says, I think should be very centrally woven into how we think about improving the lack of gender water data. So before that, I want to emphasize that, we have a rather simplistic vision, I think, if we imagine that good data is going to lead into good policy intentions. And a clear example is that, the problems of poor women are not new or unknown. And nearly every country has ratified international conventions on gender equality, including several on water. Yet what is really remarkable is that the budgets on water supply and sanitation have not crossed the 3% mark for many, many countries, even though, it's a relatively low threshold of 7%. Again, I sort of feel nervous quoting these figures from a WaterAid study in 2010, because who knows how true or not true these data sets are, especially now. But I think fundamentally, what I wanted to emphasize is that just data by itself is not going to bring about accountability. To really ensure accountability, I think what's also really important is to use the data to build the capacity of marginalized women who are really grappling with water issues. So they are also, agents in seeking accountability and so it's sort of, we tend to really minimize their role as into sort of victims or victimization of a lack of water, and we assume that all of us somewhere in the intermediary circles can do the task of ensuring accountability. I think that really needs to change. And therefore, the type of data we generate and how we use that data should really be informing these issues. And what Sally also mentioned is that, nothing should be nothing about us without us, which means the design of data sets, the knowledge around this, the information around the data set should really be planned in collaboration with those who we are talking about. The data set should, as I said, allow for transformative change, which means holding institutional actors, various actors accountable. And this process, is very much and perhaps best done perhaps by local communities. So how do we ensure this in the process of data design and collation and generation of evidence? And also, often data is just used to identify what women don't have or lack. But I think, it's really high time that we start using the data to ensure more inclusive innovations in the water sector, in technology, etc. And often what you find is that all the technological interventions are very much, done without the engagement of women. And then we take it into the community, assuming that, again, women are passive beneficiaries of this new technology, which often doesn't work because they have never been, the realities and needs of poor and marginalized women have never really been considered in this process. And, data has to be transformative. It has to question and challenge power hierarchies, especially masculinities, which is so blatant across the water sector. Especially, and this is my very last slide, especially in a world which is very data-driven, where everything is going to be shaped by big data, that's what we hear at least, and where there is really an invisibility of women in this whole big data-driven planning of everything. I think there are two things to really consider. First, that we need to be enabling the consideration of not just gender, but also social inclusion in the design of new sophisticated data technology. But I think we also need to be aware that, this sophisticated technology will not really allow capturing all the hidden dimensions of the system. And this quote is from somebody who's not a gender person at all. He's very much some person who works within the data world. So I think we have important, implication that we can draw from here. And the other thing that is really important is that the development of data, through research is not neutral. It's, in a recent study in Bihar in India, and a paper that has just been published, we find that positionality and bias really impact the research design and therefore data. And so it's not just simply about getting more data, but it's really about questioning how we design data, how we collate data, etc. And finally, I think we should not fool ourselves by assuming that there is a simple linear pathway between data, evidence, and policy interventions. So with that, I'd like to end. I hope